conducting themselves among the allies than what we see in the Black Sea and the Barents Sea. And that tells us that the Russians are also interested in maintaining a stable environment in the Arctic. It's also in their interest. And other than that, we try to make sure that we understand the Arctic as best as we can in order to have options available to meet the situation that might arise.
But do you see more military presence from Russia in these domains? I mean, since it's almost 3 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Has the picture changed in those 3 years?
See, there have been no strategic surprises. I will say that the military activity is within the expected pattern of behavior and sort of seasonal norms. You see that the war in Ukraine is costing Russia a lot, but they are still prioritizing their submarines, their nuclear second strike capability, and their aircraft and sort of their military units in the north. But we also see that, for instance, most of the land forces in the Kola Peninsula are now engaged in the Ukraine fight. But their coastal missile batteries, their submarines, their surface fleet mostly remains and are being prioritized. But this is within the expected behaviors. We don't see any strategic surprises of an overly aggressive or ambitious Russia. We see to some extent the hybrid activity previously discussed, but not currently at the same levels that you can see in the Barents, in the Baltic Sea.
But then for someone in this room who might not think about the Kola Peninsula every morning when they wake up, I assume you do. That's the first thing you think about, right? Can you explain? I mean, so you're saying that the conventional forces are to some extent being depleted because of the war effort in Ukraine. But the nuclear second strike capabilities, they remain intact. Can you elaborate a bit on why is the Kola Peninsula important for Russia?
Because it holds most of their nuclear arsenal, and the Russian strategic nuclear second strike capability, it what affords them a seat at the table in the global geopolitics. And they have investing heavily in new submarines, both for with missiles that can attack us, but they also are investing heavily in subsurface programs that will detect, survey, and sort of map the hybrid threats, our communication cables, energy cables, and so forth. And we see that Russia are prioritizing maintenance, developing new weapons, new submarines that are harder to detect, longer range, and can carry more missiles. So Russia is what they are sacrificing in volume, they are maintaining in capability, especially in the maritime and subsurface domain.
But then what is your biggest concern then? I mean, when you wake up in the morning or when you go to work, what is the biggest concerns as seen from the joint headquarters?
The biggest concern would be a major accident or environmental impact that will tax the resources just given the size of the high north. From a military point of view, that will be a strategic surprise when Russia does something that is not expected, or a long-range attack from Ukraine hits the shipyard industry, or something that changes the strategic calculus of Russia that is current in the Arctic.
So, in a way, if something were to escalate with Russia, not perhaps on the Norwegian border or not at sea, but maybe on the border between Poland and Kaliningrad, and we are actually in an escalatory situation between NATO countries and Russia, immediately your domain, the one that you're watching on these screens, will come into play?
Yes. Protecting the nuclear forces on the Kola Peninsula, being able to deploy their submarines so they maintain that advantage, is key to the Russian sort of strategy and defense. So if there is a major incursion somewhere else, the high north will come into play in some shape or fashion. So
and this, would you agree that this has very little to do with the Arctic in itself? It's not because the ice is melting in the Arctic. It's not because you're shipping vessels or doing oil and gas exploration in the Russian Arctic that these nuclear capacities are there. They have to do with something else.
They have to be the balance of power and the geopolitics. Like, it's part of the Russian strategic culture, and that's very important to the Russian state's identity as a world power. The fact that they have nuclear weapons makes them into a world power.
And these nuclear weapons needs to be in the Arctic.
Well, they are currently in the Arctic, and that's sort of the that was also why it's of concern to Canada and the U.S. and NATO, because from the Cold War, that is sort of the shortest distance to attack the U.S. homeland, and the Arctic, from a geography or from a strategic point of view, will be central, because if you control the Arctic, you have access or you can deny access.
Are you able to deny access? Or to phrase it differently, are you, the Norwegian Armed Forces, in case an escalation with Russia, are you able to control it?
I think that you are talking about the area that is 7 times the size of the Mediterranean Sea. So just from a scale perspective, Norway, nor NATO, nor Russia can control it per se. But you can manage the forces and you can sort of disrupt the force flow. But the area is so large that it's, if you look at the forces deployed to the Baltic Sea at the moment, that's a stamp of the High North. So just the area in itself makes it, but there are some areas that are more important than others, and for sure we have plans alone and together with NATO on how we're going to protect and maintain control of that in order to put ourselves at the best position.
I increasingly encounter in my work, I mean, I'm an academic looking at security and geopolitics in the Arctic, and I'm always asked by journalists, why is NATO militarizing the Arctic? And the premise is that Sweden and Finland joining NATO in 2023 and 2024, and NATO countries, to be specific, are increasing also military activity in the Arctic, especially the Norwegian Arctic, the High North. Do you agree that NATO is militarizing the Arctic?
I don't agree necessarily that NATO is militarizing the Arctic. We have increased military presence in the Arctic in order to deter Russia from further militarizing the Arctic. We respect the Svalbard Treaty, which is, from my point of view, an example that we are not militarizing the Arctic. And we also see that a lot of the Allied military activity adheres to what is current the Norwegian policy guidelines. So NATO and our allies are challenging Norwegian policy, which I think we are not militarizing, but we are deterring and we are being more active in order to avoid a further militarization from Russia in the Arctic, from my point of view.
A final question on the point of militarization or NATO. Finland and Sweden joining we heard from Jonas Gahr Støre, the Prime Minister, from the Foreign Minister of Norway as well, highlighting this as a momentous achievement in Nordic and Arctic security. Does it make us more safe? Or, I mean, it's a yes or no question, but I assume you will say yes, but then how does it make us more safe? Why does having all Nordic countries under the same defense alliance provide safety? Because it puts us on the same alliance, and I think you remove seams, you remove friction points that an adversary such as Russia can exploit. So the Nordic Defense Cooperation has been limited by the fact that we used to have NATO members and non-NATO members. And it also contributes because we can then do coherent messaging, and we can actually be more clear about our intentions, about our actions. And NATO is a defensive alliance. So NATO exists only to protect itself from aggression. So I think we are raising the bar and raising the cost for Russian aggression as seen in Ukraine by having Sweden and Finland as NATO. So I agree that it is a game-changing moment for the alliance, but also in the Arctic security setting, because now we have a border, or NATO has a border with Russia from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. And that is something that also Vladimir Putin has to take into account when he is planning his next moves. Okay, I would like to turn to Canada a bit, to Senator Duncan. I've had the pleasure of briefly living in Canada and visiting the Canadian Arctic as well. And coming from the Norwegian Arctic, I sometimes feel, or actually I feel all the time, that the Arctic is not a very good way to describe this vast space that comprises both Tromsø, where we're in right now, and Yukon, or Whitehorse as the capital of Yukon.
Right.
I mean, because the Arctic that you live in is so vastly different. Can you explain a bit that difference to us?
Certainly. It's very different in the size. We've heard in different panels, of course, and the population, in that it's thousands of square miles. It's half of Canada in landmass, but not the population. And that is perhaps a vulnerability, perhaps a strength. In the population is centered towards the lower half of the Arctic. And the governance in all three territories is a little bit different as well in terms of our relationship with First Nations people and Indigenous people. So that's a little different. In the Yukon, of course, we have a shared border with Alaska. So that presents a certain amount of comfort in some respects. In 9/11, for example, when we witnessed jetliners coming into the north, the Alaskan resources were closest to deal with any sort of a threat. And our Canadian military are scrambled from the northern part of Alberta.
But when you hear the Brigadier talking about the Norwegian situation or the Nordic situation,
Yeah.
how does the situation look like then in terms of security in Yukon? I mean, what are your security concerns?
Well, they were very well articulated, and the audience will have seen me opening the Yukon Arctic Security Advisory Council report. And Russian aggression in Europe, the melting sea ice, the Chinese air balloons that were downed over the Yukon, and our vast resources of critical minerals. These are all raising the geopolitical stakes in the high Arctic and in the north. And they are, the melting sea ice in particular, we're seeing, of course, the increased traffic. And we have different experiences. Europe has the experience of and you're living through the world wars and the occupation in your territories. Our population doesn't have that experience. So I think one of the concerns is ensuring our population is aware of the potential threats and as well the what we need for resources and so on. One of the key points, and forgive me if I'm repeating the earlier points that were so well made in the previous panel, critical infrastructure is so important in the north. And our territorial governments have pointed out the vast need for dual-use infrastructure. Our military efforts in the north are really joint efforts with the community in that, and you'll have heard me say this before, if you're building an airstrip to accommodate an F-35, you're also building an airstrip that will accommodate a flight for medical transportation south for increasing the population in the north as well.
But is it right to say that Russia, in the way that it faces Norway on the map, right, the concerns that emanates from Russia due to geography for us is not as imminent in the Canadian Arctic?
Well, think about the increased traffic with climate change and the opening of the Northwest Passage. We've seen a great deal of traffic from Chinese and Russian ships and submarines. So we're seeing it. And the previous panel, there was mention of the Rangers and how important the Rangers are to the north. They're in every community in the Yukon, for example, and in the high Arctic. They are there and seeing and witnessing this traffic and this increased research vessels.
But as you highlight, I mean, the Canadian population might not be fully aware of all these Arctic concerns, if that's the right way to describe it. The Canadian government just recently, only a month or two ago, launched a new Arctic policy talks much more about security than Canada has previously done before.
Yes, it does.
So is Canada waking up in the same way that, I mean, we talk about Donald Trump and Greenland maybe being a signal of, to some extent, bad diplomacy and not respecting the people of Greenland, but also it's a sign of US interest in the Arctic. Is the Canadian government also showing an equal amount of interest in and appreciation of the concerns in your Arctic?
Very, very much so. And it's really important to know about Canada's Arctic foreign policy is that that was developed with the northern partners. So with the governments and non-central governments, so the Yukon, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, the territorial governments, also the people, so the First Nation governments as well. And we're all involved in that Arctic policy and the development of it. So it's a living document, and it's a strong document because of the people that have provided the guidance in its drafting.
So you feel heard in Ottawa with your security concerns, with the concerns of the people?
Not only heard, I feel we're a part of Canada's Arctic foreign policy. The citizens are a part of it, and we are ensuring that it will be a living, breathing document and its implementation will occur. We are very acutely aware of the need for the infrastructure to support our efforts, of the population that's needed to be there to demonstrate our presence and of our sovereignty in the Arctic.
Steinar, or Brigadier Kongshavn, I would like to just follow up on the Canadian example here. We hear from the Senator, we also heard from the Captain in the last session on this collaboration in Canada between the armed forces or the government and the indigenous communities or native communities in providing security. How does that look like in the Norwegian context?
Well, it's a different, not problem set, because we don't have that same configuration. I think the previous panel spoke well to that. Wherever you're establishing, and we are not establishing a lot of new military infrastructure, but when we are expanding, for instance, in Finnmark, where you have a Sami population, you try to take into account and you have good coordination and communication with the locals if you're taking land that are value to them. But I think that the whole of total defense concept, if for instance you take the Norwegian coastline on the Arctic coast, there's a lot of smaller airports that we will use for a military use as well as a civilian use, which is quite unique to the many of our allies, that we have such close cooperation and sort of military and civilian society melting together in the shared concern. So when you have Russian fishing vessels that are having abnormal behavior, because they may be used for many purposes, we get informed by the local authorities of suspicious behavior. So there seems to be an increased awareness, also within the population, on the potential dangers of having sort of keeping quiet. If you see something that you are concerned about, no people are reporting it. We have much more reports coming in, and we classify it. We spend a lot more time maintaining a situation awareness on patterns of behavior for civilian vessels, the shadow fleet, military vessels, and so forth. But as a guiding principle, we work with the Norwegian people and also the local people. And I think up in Finnmark, where we do have the Sami people, we also have made progress like Canada. And to my knowledge, this is not a problem within Norway between the armed forces and the local communities.
Yeah, Senator?
If I could just add the point, we need to remember that Canada, comparatively, is a very, very young country, even compared to our southern neighbors in the United States. We're much younger, and we're a work in progress. I think, that relationship that I talked about with First Nations people, it's a work in progress. We've made substantial progress, but there's much to be done yet as well.
Also in terms of security and taking security concerns into account?
Well, in building infrastructure. the Canadians that are here are envious of this infrastructure that you have in the north. We're still building it in many communities and in a modern context. And it was also emphasized in an earlier panel about the importance of the communications infrastructures and the need for redundancy. And the government of Yukon has just completed the redundancy with the Northwest Territories, so that, because we were frequently dealing with not so much nefarious difficulties with our lines being cut, as you have outlined, but accidental, backhoe slicing. The Yukon is blessed with significant infrastructure, in part because the American military built the Alaska Highway after Pearl Harbor. And that they still contribute to some degree to maintaining that highway, but dealing with things like the challenges of melting permafrost that we're all dealing with, that challenge our infrastructure as well.
I'll return to the US in a bit. I mean,
Okay.
we can't seem to avoid that topic in this conference. But first, I want to turn to the final participant in this session here, Rear Admiral Plazana. I mean, you're an outsider, if it's fair to say, right, to the Arctic region.
Perfectly fine.
I prefer much warmer weather. I would much rather be in a warm Indian climate right now than a cold Arctic climate, but that's just me. But India is obviously not militarizing the Arctic. You're obviously not investing heavily in military infrastructure in the north for obvious reasons. But are you interested in military activity in the Arctic? Are you concerned about the trends that we're hearing when it comes to military activity in the Arctic?
Well, thank you. We are not exactly concerned. Yes, who's not concerned with militarization of any area? But we are not investing militarily in the Arctic at all. Neither, as of now, we have no interest, and we are investing only on the scientific aspects and scientific research, and none on militarization at all.
But what are your interests then? I mean, you have an Arctic policy, right, from 2022 that you're in charge of coordinating, implementing. What are your core interests, if not security related?
The theme of our Arctic policy is building partnerships for sustainable development. So, and our Arctic policy, which we gave to ourselves in 22, has 6 pillars from trade, connectivity, international governance and international cooperation, and such kind of things. So, it's basically focused on a scientific research and activity which we realize is very important for us. Therefore, our complete focus of our Arctic policy is science.
But at the same time, not to disagree with you, but at the same time, there is a geopolitical tension in the Arctic, right? And the India's Arctic policy 2022 is also a watershed moment. 2022 is in terms of Arctic geopolitics. So does the Indian government have any view on what is currently happening, increased tension in the Arctic?
We are worried with the increased tension. And otherwise, you just told me I'm an outsider, so how much can I interfere in what is going on here?
But at the same time, India is a rising great power, right? India's interests are being felt around the world. You're the largest country in the world in terms of population. Your actions are increasingly mattering to everyone, including citizens of the Arctic.
I fully agree. What happens in the Arctic affects us heavily, and we can contribute to the Arctic too. Like I've been talking earlier about the monsoon aspects, so that is definitely a thing of large concern for us because it means our survival and feeding our population. Because what happens in the Arctic affects our monsoons heavily, and the monsoons feed us because 70% of my crops are on the monsoons, and the agriculture is on them. So that is the first part. The other side, yes, we are investing heavily for sustainable development, which is renewable energy. And we, in fact, in India, as of today, we produce almost close to 200 gigawatts of renewable energy. And so now we have developed some kind of an expertise, and we are prepared to invest things for sustainable energy in other places too, and collaborate and contribute even in the Nordic areas with whosoever we can.
So on that though, on collaboration, India has, in a way, you have good relations with many states and actors, right? You have good relations with the Nordic countries, increasingly good relations with the US, and you have quite close relationship with Russia. In a sense, are you in a squeeze? I mean, when there's obviously a divide now, you have 7 Arctic countries on the one side and you have Russia on the other side. And Russia is increasingly turning to China and to India or other countries for partnership in the Arctic, whereas the 7 Western countries are increasingly trying to collaborate more together. Is India, in a way, struggling with playing on many horses at the same time?
No, we have 2 hands but broad shoulders. We can take everyone along with us and go together, and we can get them all together. We can definitely have help in that way too. We're not getting squeezed at all.
So in a way you see that India could perhaps play a constructive role?
Absolutely.
In bridging the West and Russian tension in the future?
I fully agree. We have good bilateral relations with most of the nations, almost all for that matter. So just whether you mention it's Russia or America or any other country for that matter. So therefore, since we have good bilateral relations, tomorrow when the need arises, we can get the people together because everyone else knows we don't have any hidden agenda with us. There's no personal agenda that we need in the Arctic. It's clear-cut science and collaboration. So therefore, people are more willing and they trust us. So that's where we can help to bridge the gaps and bring in people to talk together.
But then, what's your view on China then? Because to some extent, China is, I mean, it's not necessarily a rival of India, right? But it's a country that you've had your problems with throughout history, and you even have an ongoing border dispute with China. Do you see China's entry in the Arctic as a concern from an Indian perspective?
Whether it is India or China, for that matter, we both are huge consumers of energy and raw material. So therefore, when outsiders, someone looks at them, they see both of us as competitors. But not necessarily. We do have, of course, we have our own apprehensions of a certain country operating in a certain region where we might presume that it will affect our own energy requirements. Those issues do persist, but we are prepared to collaborate even with them when the need arises.
Okay, a very pragmatic approach to international relations. But can I ask you then, do you feel, this is maybe a provocative question, but I'm an academic, I can say whatever I want. Do you feel welcomed by Arctic countries? I mean, I've sat in this conference for 15 years almost. And initially, up until 2022 at least, the foreign ministers, like Espen Barth Eide, who was just there on this stage, he was very vocal about there are 8 Arctic countries and then there are outsiders. We, the Arctic countries, decide. We have territory, we have exclusive economic zones, we decide the governance of the Arctic. The rest can be included as observers in the Arctic Council or other forums, but we are the Arctic countries. That tone has shifted a bit. I mean, that fact hasn't changed that there are 8 Arctic countries, but after 2022, we see now that Western Arctic countries are maybe more inclusive in their approach to non-Arctic states. Do you feel included?
I do feel included because this is my first Arctic Frontiers meet, and I've traveled from 17 degrees north to 70 degrees north to meet all of you, and because I've been welcomed here. So yes, things have changed. Actually, once we gave ourselves our Arctic policy, it gave to ourselves kind of focus and a methodology of how to go about getting our jobs, getting our work, getting our thoughts clear-cut on the Arctic side. So this even gave a sense of comfort level to the others who read our policy. Okay, what are the interests of India in coming here? So since even others have realized as what we are looking for in this part of the world, so therefore definitely their arms have broadened a little and they're welcoming us. Next, just as most of the countries come south because we are a huge market. I mean, more than 60% of the population is in that region. I mean, India itself is 20% of the world. So if India, China, and Southeast Asia, if we include more than 60% of the world. So it's a huge market. So the Europe needs us, and we need Europe. So it's, this relationship will continue where all of us need each other either for raw material or for finished goods. Either men for manufacturing or people for manufacturing or even otherwise for consumption. So therefore, it's a give and take relation, and we all need to work together. Where our skills can help, we'll help. Where your technology can help us, we'll request. We'll collaborate and do that.
One final question, though. So on this, in this Arctic policy that you referred to, so in 5 years, 10 years, Prime Minister of India comes to you and says, Rear Admiral, what did you achieve? What do you want to tell him or her?
Oh, I would love to say so many things. I've achieved so many things, but there you'll have to cooperate with me to achieve that. I mean, for me to achieve that, I need your collaboration, your help, so that I can tell him, okay, I was an observer on the outside, now I'm an inside observer, if not an Arctic member.
Inside observer. Okay. Senator Duncan, I just want a quick follow-up on the role of, not necessarily only India, but also the role of non-Arctic actors. The way you see it from a territory in the Canadian North.
Well, as part of Canada, I would be inclined to, this assertion of sovereignty is key and fundamental to all of these discussions. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about defending the Arctic. It's okay. It was empty. It's making it absolutely clear that these are our boundaries and they are borders and maintenance of our borders. It doesn't mean we're not friendly. It doesn't mean we don't want to cooperate. It doesn't mean we don't want to trade with other individuals. But these are sovereign countries.
Okay. That's also, it echoes what the foreign minister also highlighted, right?
Yes.
Beyond borders is the team, but at the same time, there are clear borders in the Arctic.
Exactly.
But on that point, you just highlighted earlier that you share a border
We do.
with, or actually the Yukon shares a border with Alaska, but Canada shares a long border with the US. Are you worried with the signals that are coming from Trump?
Our Canadian populace and our Prime Minister has been absolutely clear in that Canada is a sovereign country, Canadians are Canadians, and we will not be becoming a state any more than the United States is likely to become the 12th or 13th province.
But do you then think that perhaps the Trump administration might require more from Canada in a way? It seems to be the overarching goal in the statements about Greenland to get the Kingdom of Denmark to step up its game when it comes to security and taking care of Greenland in a larger homeland defense perspective.
There has to be a knowledge and understanding behind statements like that. No disrespect to the president, but you have to be aware of what exactly we have and how important we are. In terms of Canada, for example, we are their largest trading partner. The critical minerals that are being sought for these defense and security initiatives, there's a lot of them in the Arctic. I would say most of them are in the Arctic and undeveloped at this point in time. And if you're going to need them, respect that we are sovereign countries and we'll work together.
Okay, clear statement there. I want to turn to you, Brigadier Kongshavn, as well, talking about Svalbard, just for a little bit. I know that it hasn't necessarily been a topic so far in this conference. It might not, or it should not perhaps be at all. But again, linking to Greenland, linking to statements that might not be, say, predicated on knowledge or necessarily respect for sovereignty. We keep getting questions about Svalbard. Are you worried about Svalbard? As it's part of the Norwegian territory. Norway has sovereignty over Svalbard, but at the same time it is an archipelago far to the north. Russia keeps poking us when it comes to Svalbard.
I'm not worried per se, but I think it echoes. It's a part of Norwegian sovereignty, and we maintain presence on it. But also the Svalbard Treaty makes it unique again in the Greenland Canada context. But I think the Russian sort of counter-narrative following Greenland is more or less rhetoric. And we are looking, and Svalbard it is interesting, and it's probably will have much more debate going forward, especially if you see an increased militarization of the Arctic. But I do think that Svalbard as is with the treaty and sort of people come to Svalbard in search of ideals and knowledge and foundation. I think that is also a good starting point. So it's not necessarily a vector only to conflict, but it can also be a path to resolution and sort of finding solutions that fits this new paradigm. But the Svalbard Treaty, from a military point of view, limits the military options that you can put on Svalbard in peacetime, but it does not limit the options you can put on Svalbard in wartime. And from that perspective, I'm not worried, but of course we are planning and preparing and maintaining an awareness on Svalbard as we do on the Norwegian-Russian border, or as we do in our harbors, or currently in the Baltic Sea.
Can I then end this conversation with you three on just a final question to you on control? In the last session we heard, the big picture session, wasn't necessarily positive, right? It focused a lot on hybrid activity and hybrid threats. Again, looking at your screens in the mountain, do you feel that you are in control, or we, Norway, the state itself, is in control of security in the Arctic?
I think we have a very good situational awareness, which we are continuously improving with new capabilities, new partners, new sensors. But I also think that we don't have an ambition to control, because it's too big, you cannot control it. It's a false prophecy. But we try to maintain the situational awareness as best we can, and we try to understand Russian actions and intentions and patterns of behavior rather than single incidents. So I think we have a good record within the alliance on our awareness and understanding of the High North, and we are continuing to improving on that with partners. For instance, looking more to the Canada and sort of Northcom, the US homeland, and connecting the dots, because the Bering Straits and sort of the Arctic are interconnected. So it goes back to the previous panel: information sharing, intelligence sharing, understanding the actions, the actors, and their intentions, and then making smart decisions. Because you can't control it, you can probably contain it in some parts, but you cannot contain or control the High North or the Arctic. It's just too big for all nations, including the US.
But the goal is to maintain, or at least try to maintain, low tension, as we heard
Of
from.
course.
Yeah.
Okay.
By being clear and by being a trusted actor that acts within set patterns of behavior. So when you deter, you try to remain within the sort of the normal. And that's sort of the cat and mouse game that we are playing on many across instruments of power at the time, with Russia heavily invested in the Ukraine, new administration, and you have sort of an ongoing evolution within geopolitics.
Okay, excellent. If you want to ask the Brigadier more questions about the cat and mouse game, or you have questions about the Indian Arctic policy, or about Yukon's increased interest in Arctic security, then grab one of these at the reception in a bit. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now we, as I promised you, we turn to the analysts that will tell us what the last panel actually said or actually meant. We'll see. Yeah, it's a tall order. I've got with me actually two academics, but to spice it up a bit, I have two journalists as well. We heard actually in the last session, one of the solutions I heard, I hope you caught that on as an editor-in-chief, one of the solutions to maybe countering some of the false narratives or hybrid activities might be more editorial control. Maybe we can get to that in a bit. But I have with me here, as I already said, Arne Oholm, who's the editor-in-chief of High North News. If you're here at this Arctic conference and you're interested in Arctic issues, but you don't read High North News, then you better start. Journalism about the Arctic from the Arctic. I have also with me Brett Simpson, who's a freelance journalist from the US, who's currently based here in the US, in Tromsø. She's written extensively about the Arctic for foreign policy, for example, but now she's here on a fellowship from the Journalist Institute of Current World Affairs. And then I have with me two excellent academics. One is my colleague, Erdem Lamashapov, from the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. Erdem has been with my colleague for 4-5 years, I don't know. There was COVID in between. It messed up my sense of time. But Erdem is just about to finish his PhD on China's interest in the Arctic and China-Russia relations in the Arctic. And then I have, last but not least, Jennifer Spence, who's the director at the Arctic Initiative at the Harvard University's Belfer Center. Canadian, but been lured down to Massachusetts to lead the Harvard into the Arctic. So actually, Jennifer, I wanted to start with you. Given what we just heard, also the last session that did not necessarily end on a high or positive note, are you worried? I mean, you come from a governance background. You've worked with the Arctic Council before you started your current position. Do you believe that the Arctic might be an arena for conflict between states?
Am I worried? I'm worried about a lot of things right now, but I'm not sure that it's about direct military conflict in the Arctic per se. I think that I was quite struck by the Brigadier's comment when he was asked what would make him, what did he wake up worrying about, and his first reaction was actually an accident. And I think that there's the reality of the risks attached, the threats that we face in the Arctic, that there's an overinflation of the military risks relative to the other concerns that we see. And so we need to start thinking more carefully about what we mean when we talk about security and how we differentiate about the different types of security and what the connections are between them. And I think that this is an important time to do that. I think that with an increased interest in defense and military comes an opportunity. Thank you to the senator. I was actually a member of the advisory council for the Yukon Security Advisory Council report. So what I appreciated about the opportunity part of that is I'm not a military and defense security person. What I am is somebody who looks at multidisciplinary issues, and what I welcomed was the opportunity to include experts who are not military and defense experts to bring in that multidisciplinarity to look at what the relationship is between those military concerns along with the broader security issues and threats that we face regularly. So.
But am I interpreting you correctly? You're saying that all this talk about geopolitical tension is a hype? I mean, the last moderator who sat here in this chair over in the middle, she said that the Arctic used to be a bastion of geopolitical stability. And I wrote that down. Like, is that true? Did the Arctic really used to be a bastion of geopolitical stability? Because the premise then is that it's not anymore, right? It's changing into geopolitical instability.
Mm-hmm. What I would say is I get really worried about the rhetoric that we're seeing and the sort of simplification. I think this is a time to be very sort of thoughtful and pragmatic and balanced in our comments. And I do get concerned at where I see there's a lot, an increasing, and this does not include the journalism that I see from my colleagues here, so to differentiate, but there's a lot of mainstream media now that is really escalating. I would propose to you escalating the risk of tension rather than being a thoughtful contributor to these things. It's not to say that I'm naive, and I have colleagues who would disagree with me. I 100% recognize that. I could name a few, and I'm sure you could too, who would tell you that this has been a long-standing concern and that we have been asleep at the wheel for some time. I think that the risks actually are comparable, that what we need to do is continue to think about a stable region and what are the mechanisms that we have to sustain that stability. And yes, there are uncertainties, and yes, there are wild cards, and yes, there are scenarios where we could see things go sideways, but then the world is that? And is that are these elements that are unique to the Arctic context? And I'm not convinced that military is where we see that. So.
Okay, I'll get back to the question on mechanisms for stability. But Adam, I want to bring you in as well. Jennifer is saying that we're not sleeping at the wheel, but some of the headlines might highlight that. Are you worried? I mean, you're looking at China specifically in the Arctic. Are you worried?
No, I'm not particularly worried. I think the thing that has changed, I guess, with the years is that we have an increased level of complexity in the Arctic. We have so many different stories happening at the same time. You know, if you just take China, you have Chinese tourists here in Tromsø. Some of them are flying drones. And is that a security issue, or is it the Chinese state, you know, the unitary state actor that is behind them, that is like sending these agents to fly drones here, or is it just people making mistakes? And then you have, you know, the entire story on the other side of the Arctic in the Beringia, which is becoming increasingly militarized, but it's not actually about the Arctic itself. It's perhaps more of a Indo-Pacific story where, you know, China seeks to get back at the United States sometimes and participates together with Russia in Coast Guard patrols, because the United States, of course, has a quite significant Coast Guard presence in South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits, which China sees as its core security domain. So we have so many different stories happening at the same time. And the level of complexity is very difficult to assess because, you know, like this very famous Chinese novel, The Three-Body Problem, you cannot calculate how three bodies are going to move around, but you can calculate that for two bodies, and it's kind of the same. And then when you look at it, there is the climate change, which, of course, all non-Arctic observers like China are also really concerned about, as we've just heard from the Rear Admiral before. So there are a lot of different interests, and the actors are actually sort of fragmented within themselves. So which part of the Chinese state is actually acting? So it's really difficult to assess, but for us as academics, I guess it's the privilege of looking at the complexity and appreciating it without having to actually make any decisions.
I love when academics argue about complexity. I mean, that's kind of what we do, right? Yeah. But I tried to read the book Three-Body Problem, and I gave up, and I saw the TV series instead. But if you had to say, what does China want in the Arctic? I mean, yes, okay, complexity, actors, different domains, different Arctics, but what does it want as a state? Not Chinese tourists flying drones, but what does China, the state China, want in the Arctic?
Well, I've been trying to understand that for a long time, but I think what we have been talking a lot about with China is, you know, its economic and scientific military interests in the Arctic, which are, of course, very big. But in my research, I also focus on a slightly different area, which is the status, the international standing aspect. And what I found is that, well, China sees itself as a great power, and obviously all great powers have interests everywhere in the world, and they seek to exert influence on regions which are, you know, far away from their core regions of influence. So China often talks about the emerging strategic domains, which are sort of the areas where the governance mechanisms are being formed, and the polar regions, together with the Antarctica, are part of that. And of course, China as a great power seeks to have a place at the table. So that's sort of what driven them. For example, if we look at the Antarctic Treaty System, when in the 1980s there was all this talk about the mining in Antarctica, and then India built a Antarctic station, and China felt this, you know, incredible embarrassment because they have not been able to construct their own station there yet. And sort of a similar mechanism has been happening in the Arctic as well. So that's one driver. But then, of course, we cannot ignore all of the material interests. So, of course, there's potential for sea routes, potential for fishing, which I don't know if it's going to happen or not, the climate change, everything that, you know, is put in the 2018 Chinese white paper on the Arctic policy.
But on that, just a quick question on that, though. We just heard from Indian representative from the National Security Council Secretariat. He did not necessarily talk about status, but we as academics can. Do you think India is seeking a similar status, or India's interest in the Arctic follows the same logic?
I have not been following India's Arctic policy in that way that I can conclude that it's probably this way or not. But I think that for India, as far as I know, what China does is quite important. So it would not surprise me if that was the case, but I cannot say anything conclusively.
How do you view that, Jennifer? I mean, India's rise, China's rise, and status as a motivating factor for engaging in Arctic affairs. Yes, you have material interests, but you might also have status-seeking interests.
Well, I think, I mean, we've seen, and this has been happening for over a decade now, a growing interest from non-Arctic states in the Arctic region. I think a lot of the, I mean, there's the sort of status component of it. I think that's definitely, I do believe that the environmental aspects and the climate aspects are a legitimate reason why I think that these are real reasons, and they are real reasons that other states should care about the Arctic. I think a lot of the other things, whether it be about resources or about transatlantic shipping routes, they're all more of an anticipatory, not to be left behind, kind of, if something happens, we don't want to not have had established ourselves in the governance of the region, versus that there's anything real that people are missing out on now, kind of mentality. I think that that's changing as the lines of relationships are shifting between Russia and the Western states in the Arctic, that because Russia has become more interested in expanding who they work with in the Arctic context, whether that be China or India or other Brazil, we've seen some of that BRICS plus kind of dynamic, that may be shifting the way that relationships evolve and the governance that it is related to. But I do think that a lot of what people are looking for is to have a position for potential opportunities in the future. And science is a really good way to establish yourself in a scientific diplomacy kind of way, where nobody needs to worry that there's anything particularly concerning about that, but it can be expanded in other ways if needed in the future. Okay.
I want to turn to Arna first. I mean, we academics, when I hear my colleague Adam and Jennifer here, they sound like one of my research papers, right? It's this and it's that, and the world is complex, and we need to nuance it, everything. But we academics are not very good at grasping immediate change, right? If you'd asked me, or I don't know what they would have answered, but if you asked me before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, I would have said, no, that doesn't make sense, right? It's not rational, doesn't make sense according to my papers. You journalists tend to be better. I know at least you are now good at putting big headlines that might be a bit more provocative, a bit more extreme in thinking. Do you agree what you've heard so far?
I agree that we both have the privilege that we don't make the decisions. We can describe the reality, but we don't make the decision. But I mean, our job, as you started to say, our job is to tell what did we hear now? What was the true? What is the snick-snack between academics and politicians? I mean, I give you an example, and that is quite provocative, and then I tell something about how I've been working on security issues in the Arctic. I mean, you had India here on the stage. India is the biggest country in the world, but also one of the countries that denies to condemn Russia's war in Ukraine. That would a journalist have used the space on stage to ask, why is it so? Because the reason we are sitting here year after year and more and discussing Arctic security is because of Russia's attack on Ukraine. That is what has changed. That is why we are afraid or scared that Russia should attack us. That's why we are discussing it. That's why we have the military sitting close to Bodø and monitoring in a totally different way than before. What would India say if Russia attacked Norway? That's the kind of question a journalist would have asked. And then to say how do we work? My own travel started when I moved to Svalbard, actually, and saw the Arctic. And living as an editor on the smallest northernmost newspaper in the world, where you have the local children garden and things like that, and then you have Russia and a geopolitic as an umbrella. So I tried to move back to my occupation as an editor in national broadcast and national newspaper, but it was dull.
No mic.
There's no mic.
No, it just cut out.
Didn't anybody
Oh,
hear
there we
what I
go.
said?
There we go.
It's back.
It was brilliant.
Okay. So when I moved back north again, and my colleagues in the national newspaper said, "What the hell? What are you doing? Why are you doing that?" And a couple of weeks ago, the same guys were standing in Nuuk in Greenland. Some of them has never been in the Arctic before. Well, they didn't even have the time to talk to the taxi drivers before they reported back home. But they were all experts on the Arctic, suddenly. That's what I call the parachute journalism. So moving back and working with this, is it dull at all? Yeah, you can look at the discussion you had here on security politics. I mean, we are living in the center of what's going on in the world.
But do you? I mean, I read High Note News, and you're good at focusing on the topical stories, but also you go in depth. But do you also contribute to this idea of a race towards the Arctic? Maybe not resource race anymore. Hopefully, we're beyond that in 2025. But maybe a geopolitical race, imminent conflict emerging. Oh, Trump says he wants to buy Greenland. Svalbard is next. I mean, these headlines are everywhere now. And although your newspaper is based in the Arctic, you do jump on the same bandwagon.
No, I don't agree with you that we jump on the same. That's why I used the example that a couple of weeks ago, or less than that, all the journalists was traveling to Nuuk. We don't have the knowledge of really what's going on. The first analysis of why Donald Trump wanted to take Greenland wasn't relevant at all. I don't want to use an example because they are not here to defend themselves. But I think our way of working is that, as you say, we live in the Arctic. We try to understand the Arctic, so we are not a part of the race as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, but when you wake up in the morning, then I mean, you probably go to the same pub as Brigadier Kongshavn, Piccadilly.
Not in the morning, no.
No. Probably Piccadilly in Bodø Centrum. But what is your fear? I mean, I've seen you talk about, you look outside your window and you see a French frigate. Are you not worried?
Oh yeah, I'm worried. I mean, in the last panel, there was a couple of people said we don't want to scare you. Well, you do scare us with what you are saying. I mean, when you are talking about the hybrid war that was from the last panel, the question I just wonder and want to ask: when does the peace end and the war start? Are we in a war already, or are we still in a peaceful situation? I mean, we have heard stories now how they attack the cables. We have hospitals, we have water, we have energy system that is very easy to attack if somebody wants to attack that. We have a situation in the high north where people are moving to the south, and as Steinar said, the cooperation between the civil society, a strong civil society, and the military is of great importance. And if we don't have people in the north, if we don't have solid institutions, hospitals, and whatever it takes to cooperate with the military and the defense, we are a problem. So there are reasons to be afraid, at least if you have children growing up.
I want to go back to one of the reasons to be afraid in a bit, but Brett, living in Tromsø now, you've been here for...
Just 6 months.
Just 6 months, okay.
So, former parachute journalist.
I mean, that's much more than most parachute journalists, I think. But how has your perspective changed? I mean, you come from the US, right? But not Alaska. You come from the lower 48, as they're called, up north. But living here in Tromsø, has your security perspective when it comes to the Arctic changed?
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up my relative position because I would have started with that, just that I am, as an American journalist, a descendant of colonizers living on Sapmi, an indigenous land, and also a non-Arctic person living in the Arctic. But also as a journalist, you strive to approach anything as an outsider. And my other position is my background is as a climate journalist first. And increasingly, as I've reported on the Arctic, it is inextricable from security concerns. But coming into these security conversations, I've been really interested, and in the past 6 months, living this absolute, front lines of climate change reality, where just, it was the wettest December in Tromsø history. We, snow up to my windows, and of course, I haven't lived a December in Tromsø before, and so I relied on others to tell me that. But it's still this kind of unprecedented reality, and that's why I think climate change and security are so clearly interlocked here. At the same time, hearing these words as a climate journalist in background, such as security, freedom, threat, sovereignty, control, my job as a journalist, I see, is to kind of press for specificity and think about when we imagine a more secure future, are we also remembering to incorporate transformation? And are we securing a status quo that, just speaking for my own country, the military-industrial complex very much perpetuated and benefited from a legacy of extractive capitalism that must transform? And so I would find those questions very, very interesting to hear the answers to.
But when you then come back to the US audience, for example, I guess when you're trying to tell your stories, eventually leaving Tromsø, don't you have to put this Arctic frame, the ice is melting, geopolitical tension is increasing, just to get that attention?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I think I was just talking about this with Arne earlier. I think that it's important, my audience is general. I am reporting for an American audience or a global audience, long form, so I also strive for complexity. I also love complexity, but at the same time, I am, you could say, either humbled or a bit disturbed, but I've had, big editors at big American publications, pitching a story about the Arctic Council. What is that? That sounds made up. Arctic Council, it sounds like a fantasy idea. So I think that what to us sitting here in this room, we all operate in a bubble of shared knowledge, and sometimes you need the cliches, like what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. We've all heard that a million times. It's actually pretty effective to explain to my mom some basic systems of climate change. So as long as I do fear, though, this turn toward sensationalism in, for instance, with the everything with Trump in Greenland, suddenly seeing colleagues of mine reporting on issues that I've been reporting on for a while, and what happens so often with politicians saying something very dramatic or attention-taking is that we all kind of start talking about it in that politician's terms. And so we forget to follow up and, go beyond imperialism or colonialism and kind of think about this region without, for instance, Trump's eyes upon it.
Arne, do you agree? Do you agree? Or do you agree that, in a way, the way I'm reading Brett is that this attention might be a positive thing, but at the same time, kind of a double-edged sword, right? There's some complexity that is lost with this attention that comes to Arctic issues, with, for example, the Greenland. And, next year there's another issue that we're talking about on this stage. Do you want this attention?
I think our Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide said yesterday in a panel that Arctic get a lot of attention, sometimes too much attention, actually. Well, it's hard to answer because living in the Arctic, that is my focus as you said, from I wake up until I go to bed. So I can't argue against the interest that is around in the world. Our goal is to be the newspaper that explains for other journalists as well, and academic.
I rely on Arne's work for sure. Yeah.
What is going on actually? So we can't complain that we got this kind of attention. We can't complain that we got a lot of wrong attention. I mean, many years ago I was sitting in a panel with journalists from India as well, and from United States and other countries, and they couldn't get their article published if it not had a picture of a hungry polar bear combined with the article, whatever it was about. That has changed a little bit, and the knowledge is about Arctic is better because of all the actions going on up here.
Okay, I want to go a bit back to security and security discussions. I go back to you, Jen, for initially. Governance. I mean, you hinted at it, right? And I know you didn't hint at it because it's all a random word you use. It's your favorite word, right? The Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is not dead. It's surviving, right? It's effective. But is it, though? I mean, with the security that we're seeing, and now even the potential, not fracture, it's a strong word, but potential disruption in Western Arctic countries' relations as well. Do you think that might impact the Arctic Council? Do you think it will survive? The Kingdom of Denmark is set to take over the Arctic Council in 3 months, 4 months from now. How do you see the future of this body that you love?
Oh, come on. No, if I'm honest, I don't predict the future. Do I think it will survive? I think that it can survive. I think that and I should also qualify, I think that it can add value, because I think there's a difference. I think it could survive and just survive for the sake of surviving and be a symbol of something that it's not anymore, and that would be unfortunate. But I do think it can survive and actually still add value, and in fact could actually add quite important value in the current context. I think that if we think about where it is right now, which is very much as possible, they've tried to depoliticize the work that the Arctic Council does in order to allow it to do to work on issues that are important in the Arctic context. I think that that's the direction it needs to continue in. I think it's a smaller, less ambitious Arctic Council, but even from a science diplomacy perspective, probably even more important now in the current context with the splitting, because I think that with a sort of what I would say high politics tension, like in the high politics kind of high political environment, it's going to become even more uncomfortable, and that the work that we see happening at the almost just below the political level, but still requires national governments and I would say almost more at the civil servant level in order to move that forward, NGOs, civil society, that kind of work, and really elevating that and allowing those networks to thrive is where the Arctic Council should put its attention. But I don't think it'll happen naturally. I think that in order for that to happen, governments need to give it the opportunity to continue to work at that level and not try to make it too many things for too many people.
So do you, put bluntly though, do you think the Arctic Council has a role to play in mitigating security concerns? Not talking about hybrid security concerns, that's a whole different ballgame, but in terms of building relations with Russia, maybe not right now, but in the near future, or other actors. Interestingly enough, in the last session, we heard Espen Barth Eide, the Foreign Minister of Norway. He was talking about relations that have been built for decades, if not even half a century, between Western countries, and how the fact that a Danish military officer is friends with and have drunk beer with an American military officer also matters in terms of managing potential tension over Greenland. But those are the exact same arguments that were used before 2022 when it came to Russia and the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council does not deal with security, no, but meeting your Russian diplomatic colleagues, drinking beer with them, actually helps to reduce tension in the long run. Do you still believe in this premise?
Yes, I think, but what I would clarify is it's not going to be necessarily at the diplomatic level. It's going to be at the researcher to researcher level. It's going to be between those who are working on very specific projects. I do. The only place I would make an exception there is I hope that one of the areas we could see some improvement that would require officials is emergency management and response. If there's one thing that I hope that all 8 states can agree to, it's that there's no winners if there aren't lines of communication that are available if there is a transboundary accident of some sort, and they don't need to be. They don't need to be huge official but there do need to be lines of communication. I'm not saying business as usual, but I'm saying lines of communication to enable those kinds of responses that ultimately we have to look at the bigger picture, and that would be an example to me of where there's an opportunity from a security broader sense, but emergency response perspective.
And we could have talked more with the Brigadier about that as well, the still ongoing channels of communication in case of an immediate crisis. But we can discuss that afterwards at the reception.
At the beer.
Yes, over beer. But Arne, you had a comment?
Just a short remark to what you said. It's always a good idea to drink beer together with each other. The problem is that the 2 most dangerous leaders in the world don't drink at all.
Okay, Adam, I want your input, not on the role of alcohol in diplomacy, but on the role of say, cooperation, not necessarily the Arctic Council, but as we highlighted already, right? Russia has turned increasingly towards China. You're researching this relationship as well. Is this division being solidified, you think?
Yes, I think it is. And I think if we look at some words that are being used here at this conference, I think for me personally, 2 phrases stand out. It's the civil-military fusion and the dual use. And we talk a lot about these 2 phenomena, and in 2 very different ways. It's very bad when China is using them, and it's good, or perhaps we wish that NATO could do more of that. But it seems to me that it's like an international norm or in practice that states actually do that. And I think, the importance of cooperation in this context is that we have to sit down at a table and sort of agree on the rules, what we actually understand that is good to be doing and what we should avoid to be doing. So at least if we cannot go back to the way cooperation was before Russia invaded Ukraine, but some sort of groundbreaking rules for how things should be done in terms of science. I think that's where I would put my eyes towards.
Do you agree, Brett?
Well, I was just going to say that it would be my view that it is a security threat, the fact that Western sanctions have completely cut off crucial collaborations in climate science in the High North. I think, in order to prepare for what's happening, we need to be able to collect data and create more accurate models. And I think that it's in the best interests of global security, and I've heard this from many scientists that I've spoken to that wish that this was incorporated more into a security. This sense of creating projections and wargaming, and what are future risks? Well, the greatest risk facing the planet is climate change, and this is something that I talked about a bit offline just earlier with Brigadier Kongshaven, who said that this is something that he hears time and again from analysts, think tanks, scientists. It's not really Russia. It is climate change. That should be your number 1 worry and threat, and it's something that militaries are increasingly adapting to as well. So this lack of data, this breakdown that is very much playing out within the Arctic Council as well, and this collapse of partnerships, I think, is undercovered, and it's hard to talk about what's not happening. That's maybe a direct quote from an editor that didn't want this story. But I think it's still crucial, and we need to be able to imagine futures and alternatives to talk about climate change, and talk about security, and talk about, we're talking about the same thing, which is future generations' survival and safety.
But not to be sound like a hawk, the one who set up the security panel, but when we are facing a probability of war with Russia, I mean, Norway has a almost 200 kilometer long border with Russia. Finland has 1,340 kilometer long border with Russia. And if the Putin regime were to become even more unstable, because of domestic reasons or whatnot, or something might occur, as we talked about in the first session, on the border of Kaliningrad or Belarus. I mean, when we're facing that prospect, that becomes much more immediate. No, I'm more worried about Russian potential escalation and maybe even invasion if things go really bad than I am about climate change.
Maybe you shouldn't be. But I understand that. I do understand that perspective. And I think that it's easy to also, for myself, again, not a decision maker, to sit on the sidelines and observe, but I also, talking to many different experts and, whether they're analysts or officials or scientists, kind of wishing for more opportunities like this one, where there's, sitting at a similar table and actually, having those concerns weighed against each other. But I do think it's a very, very tough problem, and how those science partnerships would actually continue. It's not my job to try to solve it, but I do think that it is something that I've heard time and again from the science community, that particularly science sanctions should be reconsidered in light of, Russia is half the geographical Arctic. It contains 2/3 of the globe's permafrost. If we don't know what's happening there, and satellites can only get you so far from, besides ground truth observations, that in itself is a security threat.
Jen, quick response?
No, it's a two-finger. It's more to agree in the sense that I think that we shouldn't, surviving the short term to burn up in the long run would be a certain kind of thinking that I'm hoping we can get beyond, because ultimately if we survive military war to live in a world, or have our children live in a world that isn't livable, then I think we've missed the point. And then I totally missed my. No, it's gone. My other thought.
I was just going to say it's not either or. Would be my. It's just, and militaries know this as well. The NATO just set up last year the Center for Excellence in Climate and Security, and the American military, as of before last week, had many similar apparatus in place. It's in our best interest to consider climate and security as absolutely interlocking issues.
Anna, you wanted to say something? But I wanted to ask you something instead. Because we're running out of time, and I asked the Brigadier about Svalbard. You highlighted Svalbard as well, as someone who's actually lived there and worked there and been editor of Svalbardposten. Going to the question that I asked the Brigadier, are you worried about Svalbard in terms of security and vulnerabilities?
I honestly think the Brigadier gave a very good answer to that, talking about the framework and how we have cooperated with Russia on Svalbard and the way the treaty works. But I understand the discussion we have these days, that was started a week or two ago, whether we should militarize Svalbard more than we already do. I don't know what that really means. Does that mean to have more ships? Then I can, like marine warships around Svalbard, then I can understand it. If that means that we have to put soldiers on Svalbard, I think that is another dance, another thing, to see uniforms in the street. I'm afraid that will open up a conflict that we really doesn't need. It's actually, that is maybe the most difficult discussion or hardest to be sure, if you put that look at Svalbard together with the northern part of Norway, which actually the Brigadier did as well. For me, it's a question about the Article 5 in NATO. When does that when does that be activated? Would an attack on Svalbard, and that is not to say that will be an attack, but if there was an attack on Svalbard, or if there was an attack on the eastern part of Finnmark, would that automatically put Article 5 into work? And what does that mean if it doesn't work or doesn't act? And if we act for Article 5, do we then have a new world war? I mean, these are the questions that I'm quite interested in and like to discuss. And I will also add, actually, just as an experience from our staff, I think, in the newspaper, that working on this issue together with the military all over the world, actually, because we are in touch with them, as many in the United States as in Norway. I feel in a way that they are more open-minded to discuss this question than some of our politicians actually are. That has been a change for the last few years. And to add just one more in the end, what we lack of discussion on these issues is not so much on NATO, but the bilateral agreement we have with the United States. Because then you touch into democratic issues and the democratic decision in a country. And I would like that we, especially, of course, with Trump in charge, have more discussion about what consequences these have for the Arctic.
Just a very quick follow-up, though. Yesterday, I heard you in a debate about EU membership. It was in Norwegian and at the pub. It's a bit more informal than this, perhaps. But did you conclude in the end? I had to leave before you finished. I mean, is the EU the alternative for Norwegian security? If you're saying we have to question our relationship with the US a bit more, look into these bilateral agreements, does Article 5 really apply? I mean, the government would say, yes, of course it does, but there's uncertainty. Is the EU then the solution? Is that what you concluded yesterday?
It's not a solution to everything, but if you ask my personal opinion, it is pretty strange. And this is a complicated question in Norway, so it would take a long time to argue about it. It's very complicated, and it means a lot of feelings. But of course, the European Union and organizations like the European Union play a very important role, especially in the question about democracy and keeping democracy, because the democratic part of the world are shrimping almost every day, and it feels kind of strange to stand outside an organization like the European Union and just accepting what they do instead of being a part of discussing how we develop it.
If you strongly disagree with Arne's EU opinion, then corner him in a couple of minutes. I guess some of you do. The EU is a touchy topic in Norway. But Brett, I wanted to end with you, trying to end on an optimistic note. After these two security sessions that have been rather bleak, to be honest. I mean, again, you've lived here now for 6 months. That's probably changed a bit your outlook, and you still say that climate change is the primary security concern that we should have, not necessarily an optimistic outlook, but can you give a positive spin to this? I mean, how has coming from the outside, living in the Arctic, not being a parachute journalist, helped you perhaps gain a positive outlook to Arctic geopolitics and security?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to answer that, I can quote, and probably some people in this room know, the international director of the Norwegian Polar Institute, Kim Holmein. To quote him, he has said to me, the Arctic is still here. And I think that there are so many narratives that it's fast melting and there's competition, and we're here, we're standing here right now. And I think that that's a constant paradox of reporting on climate change, is that we are living in a transforming world, and security, by the way, like living in a transforming world, uncertainty, don't know who our leaders are, don't know if we can trust them, and yet at the same time, you know, you can go outside and still count the number of Arctic terns who are sitting, you know, out in the marshland, or there's a kind of reassurance, I think, that living in the Arctic affords any person as a privilege to say, living here, maybe and being here for all of you, you're an unintentional archivist. Like, you are seeing an Arctic that will never exist again, at least in human memory, and that's bittersweet. So on the one hand, we can see it as something that is fast disappearing, but we can also see it as something that is still here.
Wow, you made me almost want to move back to the Arctic. But I think it was a good positive note. Please give them an applause. And join us all for further conversations. We're organizing another Arctic Security Conference in Oslo in September, for those of you who want to attend. And now we're going for chats at the main reception. Thank you again.